I'm Evelina Miller, 33, and I clawed my way through Quantico with nothing but discipline, debt, and a chip on my shoulder. For years, I supported my fiancé while deployed, sent every dollar home, trusted him with everything. But when I came back to an empty apartment and a drained account, I made a decision that changed the course of my life. Ever been betrayed by someone you built your future around? Drop your story in the comments. Trust me, you're not the only one. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to take justice into your own hands, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about standing tall when others try to knock you down. What happened next? Even I didn't see coming. My name is Evelina Miller, and I've worn a uniform for most of my adult life. Discipline wasn't something I had to learn. It was the air I breathed growing up. My father was Army. So was his father. My older brother, too. Service was how the Miller family defined contribution. There were no family businesses, no generational wealth. Just calloused hands, long deployments, and the idea that doing something hard and thankless could still be honorable. I enlisted right after college. Not because I didn't have other options, I did, but because I felt like I owed something. To the country, to my family, to the kind of stability the military had always represented in my life. ROTC had paid for school, and by the time I graduated, I was ready to trade lecture halls and late-night cram sessions for boots, sand, and structure. I joined the Air Force as a security forces officer. It was demanding, but I loved it. The expectations were clear, the standards high, and there was something deeply satisfying about earning respect in a world that didn't hand it out easily. It was during basic that I met Ryan. He wasn't military, he was working logistics for a defense contractor near the base. We met during a volunteer community cleanup project where our units crossed paths. He offered to help me carry a box of bottled water to my truck and cracked a joke about how I looked like I could bench press him. I didn't laugh, but I smiled. That was rare back then. We ran into each other again a few weeks later at the local gym, and this time he asked if I wanted to grab coffee after our workouts. That first conversation lasted 3 hours. He asked about my deployment schedule, what books I liked, why I chose security forces over other career fields. It was easy. Steady. Like taking a breath after holding it for too long. Things moved quickly. Within 4 months, we were spending most of our free weekends together. He was grounded in a way that drew me in, not flashy or overconfident, just kind and consistent. While most of the guys I dated before Ryan struggled with my job, he leaned into it. Said he admired what I did. Never made me feel like I had to choose between ambition and affection. When I was selected for my first overseas deployment, he didn't flinch. "I'll be here when you get back," he said, holding my hand the night before I flew out. "We're a team." That word stuck with me. Team. Before I left, we made a plan. We'd start saving seriously for a house, maybe something near the base in San Antonio where I was hoping to be stationed next. We opened a joint account. I set up my pay to deposit directly into it. He took care of the rent on our shared apartment, the bills, the paperwork. I left copies of everything with him, bank info, insurance docs, even a draft of my power of attorney in case something happened. It wasn't blind trust. It was calculated. We talked through every step. I still remember how careful he was the day we set up that account. Sat next to me at the credit union with his arm draped lightly over the back of my chair, nodding along as the banker explained interest rates and savings yields. When I signed, he gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. This is for our future. Deployment was grueling. 16-hour shifts in heat that melted the soles off cheap boots. I ran patrols, responded to base intrusions, wrote reports until my fingers cramped. The days bled together. I slept in snatches. I ate standing up more often than not. But every time I got a letter from Ryan, it felt like the world paused for a second. He wrote about missing me, about looking at houses online, about how he started cooking more and cut back on takeout so we could save faster. I didn't just believe him, I needed to. We'd talk every Sunday if the comms held. He always asked how I was sleeping, whether my unit was treating me well, if my boots were still holding up. I'd give him updates on what I could, mostly the mundane, sanitized details, and he'd fill in the blanks about life back home. He said the apartment felt empty without me, that even our cat seemed depressed. He was careful never to sound whiny or clingy. Just patient. Present. The money kept building. I was meticulous about tracking it on my end, checking the balances every time I could snag secure access. Ryan and I had agreed we wouldn't touch it until we hit a certain number, enough for a down payment, some emergency cushion, and a few months of overlap to transition when I got back. He started sending me links to homes in neighborhoods we talked about. Sent photos of open houses he'd toured, scribbled notes in the margins about layout, traffic, school ratings. It was never pushy, just thoughtful. Sometimes he'd text me snapshots from hardware stores, paint swatches, backsplash tiles. Too modern, he'd write. Or future kitchen vibes? Looking back, I should have realized something was off. Not because he seemed too perfect, but because his life suddenly felt like it revolved entirely around me. Around us. Every letter, every call, every update felt designed to reassure me. And maybe that's what I needed at the time. Maybe that's why I didn't ask more questions. I missed him. Badly. When mail was slow or comms were down, I'd scroll through the old photos he sent, him holding a takeout box in front of the TV, grinning like an idiot. A selfie of him making pancakes in our tiny kitchen. A blurry shot of our cat sleeping with one paw over its face. That's what I fought for. Not some abstract ideal of patriotism or duty. I fought for that life. For that man. For the version of home I'd built in my mind. A place where Ryan was waiting, our savings were safe, and everything I endured out there would be worth it. By the 6th month, I had a countdown on the inside flap of my journal. 64 days. Then 53. Then 28. I started dreaming about the reunion at the gate, the way his face would light up, the relief in his hug, the way it would feel to hand over the uniform for a few days and just be someone's partner again. He asked what I wanted to do when I got back. I said I wanted to sleep for 2 days and then go house hunting. He said, deal. I'll even cook. He sent one last letter a few days before I boarded the flight home. Said he had a surprise waiting for me. I smiled at that. Imagine flowers on the table. Maybe a lease agreement he'd already signed. Maybe he'd painted the bedroom. I didn't care. I just wanted home. When I landed, I turned my phone on the second I hit the tarmac. No new texts. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes timing just didn't align. I collected my gear, cleared through customs, boarded the final bus back to base. Still nothing. By the time I walked into our apartment complex, it was just past midnight. I tried the door. Unlocked. But inside, everything was gone. Not just some things. Everything. No furniture. No cat. No Ryan. Just a blank apartment and the sound of my own breathing. I called him. Straight to voicemail. I checked our joint account. Empty. Logged into our backup savings. Gone. Credit cards? Maxed and closed. It didn't make sense. Not right away. I thought maybe something had happened. Maybe an emergency, maybe theft, maybe he was hurt. Maybe there was a good explanation. But as I stood in that echoing space, staring at the imprint where our couch used to sit, I knew. He hadn't waited. He hadn't planned a surprise. He'd taken everything, every dime I earned, every document I trusted him with, and vanished. The signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. About 3 months into my deployment, I noticed the shift. At first, it was subtle. Ryan's messages got shorter. The funny little observations he used to include, about the neighbor who sang opera while taking out the trash, or how our cat had figured out how to open the cabinet where the treats were, those started disappearing. Instead, it was just, hope you're doing okay, or work's been crazy, I'll try to write more this weekend. When I asked how things were going with the house search, he said he'd paused for now. Not much worth seeing, he wrote. Better to wait till you're back so we can decide together. That made sense. Logical. Considerate, even. I told myself he was being practical, that he didn't want to make any big decisions without me. But that wasn't like him. He'd been so eager before. He stopped mentioning little things. The errands he ran, the meals he cooked, the shows he was watching. At one point, I realized I didn't even know where he was living. We had agreed he'd stay in the apartment until my return, but the last few letters made no mention of it. I asked outright in a message, "Are you still at the place on Grant Street?" No answer. A few days later, he responded to a different question I'd asked, something about whether the bank had sent the updated account info to the P.O. box, but ignored the one about the apartment. That became a pattern. Avoiding specifics. Answering just enough to keep me from asking more. I chalked it up to stress. The time difference. His job. Then he missed my birthday. No card. No email. Not even a text. For 7 years, Ryan never forgot my birthday. Not once. He used to make such a big deal out of it, even when we were broke, even when I told him I didn't care. One year, when we were both working double shifts and barely saw each other, he packed a lunch for me with a note inside every Tupperware. One said, "Start here," the next said, "Don't cry," and the last one had a tiny folded paper heart with a ring pop taped inside. It was dumb and perfect and very Ryan. So when my birthday came and went with nothing, not even a belated message, I knew something was wrong. I tried to reach him. Left a voicemail. Emailed. Texted. 2 days later, he replied with a single line. "I'm sorry, I've been slammed at work. Happy late birthday." That was it. No explanation. No voice message. No, I hate that I missed it. Just an apology with no weight behind it. I remember sitting on my cot that night, reading that line over and over. I told myself not to spiral. I'd seen people lose relationships over distance and poor communication. I didn't want to be one of them. He wasn't a bad person. He was just under pressure. We both were. A few weeks after that, a mutual friend, Jeremy, sent me a message. Said he'd run into Ryan at a bar downtown. "He looked good," Jeremy wrote. "Didn't realize you were back." I wasn't. I stared at that line for a long time. I asked what made him think I'd returned. Jeremy said Ryan had been out a lot lately. That he was usually with the same group of people, some guys from the gym, a few new faces. Said he seemed different. Not bad, just not like himself. I asked if he'd mentioned me. Jeremy took hours to respond. Then he just said, "Not really." The next time I managed to call, Ryan didn't pick up. I tried again the following day. No answer. That weekend, I sent a long email. Not angry, just honest. I said I'd noticed he seemed distant. That I was worried. That I missed him. He replied 3 days later. "I'm sorry," he wrote. "I guess I've just been feeling a little off. Work's been rough and it's hard being apart. But I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere." I read that sentence a dozen times. I'm not going anywhere. At the time, it felt like a promise. Now, I can see it for what it was, preemptive damage control. Words meant to hold me still while he drifted further away. I asked if we could set a time to talk on the phone. He said sure. Suggested a Sunday evening. When Sunday came, I stayed up past midnight waiting for his call. Nothing. I finally called him. Straight to voicemail. The next day, he messaged, "Sorry, I crashed early last night. Let's try again this week." We didn't. After that, communication trickled down to almost nothing. I'd send updates about my deployment, and he'd reply with a thumbs-up emoji or a brief, "Glad you're staying safe." Once, I mentioned that I'd finally been assigned a return date. I thought that would wake him up a little, remind him that soon, we'd be in the same place again. He just said, "That's good. We'll talk logistics soon." Logistics. Not, "I can't wait to see you." Not, "I miss you like hell." Just logistics. I started asking around, quietly. Messaged a few people from our old social circle. Casual questions. Nothing too obvious. Most of them hadn't seen much of Ryan lately. Or if they had, they didn't mention me. One girl I barely knew from a mutual friend's birthday party messaged me out of the blue. "Hey, random question, are you and Ryan still together?" I remember just staring at the message, rereading it with a pit in my stomach. I replied, "Yeah, why?" She said she saw him at a rooftop party downtown last weekend, and he was introducing himself as single. That didn't make sense. Ryan wasn't the kind of guy who went to rooftop parties. He didn't like crowds. Didn't drink much. I told myself she must have been mistaken. But then I remembered that bar Jeremy mentioned. The gym buddies. The new group of friends. And I realized I didn't know who he was spending time with anymore. I didn't know where he was living. I didn't know anything. Every time I brought it up, even gently, he'd either deflect or go silent. I started sleeping less, eating less, running more. Anything to burn off the unease that clung to me like humidity in the desert. My team noticed. Asked if everything was okay back home. I lied. Told them Ryan was just busy. That he'd always been quiet under stress. That was the hardest part, having to pretend. To keep doing my job, leading my team, staying alert, while my personal life unraveled thousands of miles away. The final email I sent before returning home was short. I land on the 17th. I'll take a cab to the apartment unless you're around. He didn't reply. By then, I wasn't surprised. I didn't want to believe it. But somewhere deep down, I knew he wasn't the same man I left behind. And whatever future we had talked about, he'd already walked away from it. Quietly. Without a fight. Without a goodbye. The flight home felt longer than the entire deployment. Maybe because I wasn't distracted by the constant hum of duty. No radios chirping, no bass noise to drown out thought. Just time, hours of it, to wonder how things would be when I stepped off the plane. By the time we landed, it was close to midnight. I grabbed my duffel, cleared customs, and kept checking my phone like he might suddenly remember I existed. Nothing. No missed calls. No texts. I told myself he probably fell asleep waiting. The apartment complex looked the same, quiet, dimly lit, the same cracked sidewalk leading up to our unit. I punched in the door code with muscle memory. The lock clicked. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. No smell. No sounds. No trace of a life shared. The living room was empty. No couch. No bookshelf. No framed photo of us in Sedona. Just dust outlines where the furniture used to be. I dropped my bag at the door and walked from room to room like I was touring a stranger's home. The kitchen had a single fork left in the drawer. The bedroom was stripped to bare carpet. No sheets. No clothes. No note. I stood there for a long time. Not moving. Not thinking. Just standing in the echo of what used to be a life. When I finally pulled my phone out, I called him. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. I checked our joint bank account. 0. Savings. 0. The line of credit we'd opened together for emergency repairs? Overdrawn. My heart was pounding, but my hands stayed steady. I logged into our shared email, the one we used for apartment bills, planning, anything joint. Password changed. I tried the backup account I rarely used, the one where I kept a small savings buffer just in case. Gone. Closed 3 weeks ago. I sat on the floor of the empty living room and stared at the numbers on the screen. Every single dollar I'd earned during my deployment, months of double shifts, missed holidays, blistered hands, sunburnt skin, sleepless nights, was gone. At first, I didn't even cry. It felt too big, too sharp. Like my brain refused to compute it. When I finally stood up, I pulled my laptop from my duffel. I logged into my credit profile. It didn't even look real. There were 4 new accounts in my name. Personal loans. One for $15,000. Another for $8,000. 2 smaller ones from fast cash lenders. All opened while I was overseas. There were late fees. Missed payments. Defaults. He hadn't just taken what was mine. He'd borrowed what wasn't. I started making calls at 2 a.m. fraud reports. Account disputes. I filed a police report online with the little information I had, his full name, date of birth, social, last known address. I included screenshots. Account numbers. Dates. The officer I spoke to the next morning sounded sympathetic, but not surprised. I'll be honest, he said. This kind of thing happens more than you'd think. Especially with service members. I knew what he meant. Trusting someone to take care of things while you're deployed is common. So is coming home to betrayal. They took my statement and opened a case. But they warned me there wasn't much they could do unless I could locate him. I tried. His phone was disconnected. His personal email bounced back. Every one of his social media accounts was deleted or wiped. I called his last known workplace, the defense contractor near the base. He doesn't work here anymore, the receptionist said. No forwarding info. I tried his mother. She and I had only spoken a few times, but I figured if anyone knew where he was, it'd be her. The number rang 3 times, then went to voicemail. I left a message. She never called back. The silence was somehow worse than a confrontation. There was no yelling, no tearful goodbye, no explanation. Just the cold precision of someone who planned their escape while you were too far away to stop them. I kept thinking about the letters he'd written, the way he described our future, the links to houses, the talk of backsplash tiles and kitchen colors. Every detail had felt real, tangible, and now I couldn't tell whether he ever meant a single word of it. My command got wind of the situation within the first week of my return. Not by choice, I was flagged for a credit issue during a routine security check. Someone from personnel pulled me into an office, handed me a manila envelope, and said they needed to review my finances. I sat there, trying to explain that the loans weren't mine, that I didn't take out thousands of dollars while deployed, that my credit score tanking wasn't a sign of instability. The woman just nodded, flipping through papers, taking notes. "We'll mark the file," she said. "But I have to be honest, this may delay your clearance renewal." That was when I finally broke. Not at the apartment, not at the bank, but in a beige office chair under fluorescent lights, being told that someone else's betrayal might cost me the only career I'd ever wanted. I called a friend from training, Lauren. She picked up on the second ring. "You back? I need a place to crash." She didn't ask questions. Just gave me the code to her garage and told me to let myself in. That night, I sat on her couch with a legal pad, writing down everything I could remember. Dates, account numbers, emails, messages. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about survival. How to fix my credit. How to report the fraud to every bureau. How to talk to a JAG officer without falling apart. I spent the next 2 weeks filling out paperwork. Fraud affidavits, identity theft claims, letters to lenders. Every call started the same way. "I'm calling to dispute charges made in my name without my consent." And every time I said it, I hated how calm I sounded. Like this was just a clerical issue, not a complete unraveling of trust. I started keeping a file, one of those expanding folders with tabs. Every form, every report, every copy of every screenshot. I labeled it with his name. Not out of anger. Out of necessity. I needed to keep it straight. Because Ryan wasn't a person anymore. He was a case. A debt. A shadow I had to keep chasing down. One morning, I received a letter from a collections agency. They were demanding payment for one of the loans, $8,000 plus interest. The envelope had my name on it, my address, and a note inside that read, "Final notice before legal action." I stared at it for a long time before placing it carefully into the folder. It didn't matter how it started. The man I thought I'd marry had stripped my life bare and disappeared. And if no one else was going to hold him accountable, then I would. I didn't tell my sister the whole story when I showed up at her door. Just that the relationship had ended and I needed a place to stay. She didn't ask for details. Just handed me a spare key, pointed toward the guest room, and said the sheets were clean. Ava and I hadn't been especially close growing up. She went the creative route, journalism, photography, while I took the structured path. But in that moment, she didn't need the full picture to understand that something had broken. I was careful. Paid rent in cash. Took short showers. Kept my things folded neatly in a corner of the room. I was living like a guest in someone else's life, waiting for mine to resume. What I didn't say out loud was that it wasn't just a breakup. It wasn't even just financial betrayal. It was a dismantling. One piece at a time. Ryan hadn't just stolen my money, he'd taken my sense of judgment with it. I kept thinking, how did I not see it? Every moment of doubt during deployment suddenly felt sharper in hindsight. I reread old messages, trying to pick apart the silences, the vague answers, the subtle disappearances. It was like watching a movie where the twist ending ruins everything that came before it. My clearance review was still pending, and until they finished their internal evaluation, I was sidelined. No field assignments. No access to sensitive data. I showed up in uniform, did admin work, and waited. My commanding officer called me in one afternoon. He closed the door gently, like he already knew the conversation wouldn't be easy. "We can move you," he said. Different base. Fresh start. Just say the word. I nodded, but didn't answer. He didn't press. Just tapped the desk twice and told me to take whatever time I needed. The idea of moving again didn't appeal to me. I didn't want to pack another duffel bag or transfer files to another station. I didn't want a fresh start. I wanted something irreversible. Something that didn't rely on who I had been with him. That's when I remembered Quantico. I'd considered the bureau once before, right after undergrad. But I'd chosen a different path. Shorter training. More immediate deployment. At the time, I thought action was the best way to prove myself. Now, I needed something more permanent. Something that didn't just get me out of this moment, but kept me out. I filled out the application quietly. Printed out forms at the base, emailed letters of recommendation, dug out my transcripts. There's a part on the application where they ask why you want to be an agent. The first time I read it, I sat in front of my laptop for almost an hour. I could have written something polished. I believe in justice. I want to serve at a higher level. But what I typed instead was honest, because no one should be allowed to disappear after stealing someone else's life. I deleted it before submitting. Wrote something more appropriate. But I kept that first line scribbled in my notebook. The invitation to Quantico came 6 months later. In that time, I'd managed to resolve some of the credit issues. Filed formal identity theft complaints. Closed the joint accounts. Rebuilt what I could. But my score was still low enough to raise eyebrows during background. When they called me in for the polygraph, the examiner asked about financial instability. I told him the truth. My ex-fiancé took out loans in my name while I was deployed overseas. I've been clearing it up ever since. He looked at me for a long time. Didn't ask if I'd pressed charges. Just nodded, wrote something down, and moved on. Quantico was everything I expected. Long days. Longer nights. The constant demand to prove you belong there. But I didn't mind the pressure. It gave shape to the shapeless rage I'd been carrying. Every morning run, every firearm drill, every dry recitation of statute and protocol, it was all fuel. Every push-up was one more way to burn the shame out of my bloodstream. There was no time to dwell. Between coursework and training rotations, we were pushed to our limits. If you couldn't keep up, you were cut. Most people there had something to prove. Some came from military backgrounds like mine. Others were former prosecutors, forensic analysts, local law enforcement. But all of them carried the same edge, this sense that justice wasn't just a concept. It was personal. I didn't talk about Ryan. Not to my instructors. Not to my classmates. When someone asked why I was there, I just said I was ready for the next chapter. That was true. But it was only half of it. The other half lived in my bones. I couldn't go back to being someone who believed people were what they said they were. I couldn't forget the way silence had replaced promises. He'd left me in an empty apartment, bank accounts drained, credit destroyed. And no one, not even the police, had been able to track him. But I was learning how. Learning how to follow trails. How to read digital footprints. How to interpret banking patterns. How to detect deception without needing a confession. The more I trained, the more I realized I didn't want him back. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted to be the kind of person who could see it coming next time. The kind who wouldn't mistake patience for deceit. By the end of the program, I'd earned my credentials. Security clearance reinstated. Financial issues annotated and resolved. I still remember the moment I was issued my badge. It was smaller than I thought it would be. Simple. Clean. But when I held it in my hand, it felt like weight. Like proof that I hadn't just survived what he did, I'd built something from it. People talk about healing like it's a return. For me, it wasn't. It was a construction. Brick by brick. Push-up by push-up. Page by page of case law. Every time I stared down a suspect during training, I imagined the way Ryan used to look when he talked about our future. Calm. Confident. Convincing. And I thought, I know what you look like now. Not because of the heartbreak, but because I learned to see what was underneath it. I didn't need an apology. I needed to become someone he'd never see coming. And I was almost there. In the bureau, I kept things separate. Work was work. Personal history didn't enter the room. When people asked why I joined, I gave the standard answer: career growth, public service, the challenge. It wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't the truth. No one knew what had happened with Ryan. Not my partner during field rotations, not my supervisor, not the handful of people who actually liked me enough to ask about my life before the bureau. I gave them the polished version: prior service, single, no kids, focused on the job. That was enough to keep questions at bay. I didn't need sympathy. I needed leverage. By year 3, I'd found my lane. Financial crimes. Everyone wanted to work high-profile threats: counterterrorism, cyber, trafficking. But I liked the numbers. The patterns. The quiet way fraud unfolded, hidden in paperwork and spreadsheets, invisible until someone connected the dots. I was good at it. Not because I was naturally gifted, but because I'd spent the better part of a year untangling the aftermath of my own financial wreckage. I knew what shell accounts looked like. I knew how people disappeared behind business filings and phony addresses. I knew what it felt like to open a statement and not recognize your own life in the numbers. When I made the transfer official, my new SC handed me a thick folder of backlog cases. "Start here," she said. "Most of this is dead ends. But let me know if anything jumps." I didn't say it out loud, but I preferred dead ends. They were cleaner. Less noise. You could trace a problem to its source without the distraction of chaos. I spent late nights at my desk sorting through wire fraud alerts and fake LLCs tied to laundering operations. The Pacific Northwest had become a hotbed for it, shell companies hiding dirty money through real estate deals that didn't make sense. Properties bought and sold in a matter of weeks. Listings that never hit the market. Large transfers with no explanation. It was during one of those nights, just after 11 p.m., half the floor dark, only 2 of us still working, that I saw it. Buried inside a suspicious transaction list connected to a seafood restaurant in Tacoma, there was a name that stopped me cold. It wasn't his full name. Not the one I knew. But the middle initial was the same. The birth year matched. And the handwriting on the document, scanned in from an original business application, was his. I hadn't seen it in almost 6 years. But I knew it. You don't forget the way someone signs their name when you've stared at it on every bank form, lease agreement, and shared tax return. The small flick at the end of the R. The slight tilt left, not right. I double-checked the address. A post office box. Then a restaurant name that hadn't filed taxes in 3 years. Then a matching EIN that showed a different name, a holding company for a short-term rental operation. It was layered. Deliberate. But not quite invisible. I stared at the screen for a long time. My first instinct wasn't anger. It wasn't even shock. It was clarity. That same sharp-edged silence I felt the night I walked into the empty apartment. Except now I had tools. I flagged the entry. Created a side file. Cross-referenced the name with known aliases. He was using a new last name, one he'd pulled from his mother's side of the family. There were traces of him all over the paperwork. Patterns I recognized. Phone numbers registered to burner accounts. Cash transfers always under $10,000. Shell LLCs registered in Wyoming and Delaware. It was sloppy in a way. Like someone who knew just enough to stay ahead of the average lender, but not enough to stay ahead of the bureau. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly building the file. Every spare moment, I dug deeper. Traced shell companies to shell companies. Created a diagram so complex it needed a second monitor. Eventually, I traced the restaurant ownership to a real holding company, legitimate on paper, but tied to multiple accounts that passed large sums of cash through in irregular intervals. One of those accounts had been used to buy a condo in Portland. The deed was signed under the new name. But the signature, it was the same. I had him. He hadn't vanished. He hadn't gone far. He'd just moved west, changed his name, and rebuilt himself on the same rotten foundation. The restaurant was real. A mid-tier seafood place that did well enough to stay off most radars. I pulled surveillance. He managed it himself, appeared in the footage twice, walking the floor in a pressed button down, shaking hands with guests. He smiled like nothing had ever happened. I didn't go to my supervisor right away. Not because I was hiding it, but because I needed more. A case. A clean one. One that didn't sound like a personal vendetta. I tied him to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of tax evasion. It wasn't enough for a massive takedown, but it was enough to put him in cuffs. When I finally briefed my SC, I kept my voice even. Focused on the numbers. The irregularities. The connections. She nodded along. Then she asked, "How'd you get onto this?" I looked her in the eye. "Something about the paperwork caught my attention," I said. She didn't press. Just handed me the green light. We scheduled the arrest for a Thursday night, just before closing, when the restaurant would be quiet and the staff would be winding down. We had backup. 2 agents stationed outside. 1 inside with me. I didn't need a weapon. Just my badge. When he walked toward the back room, I stepped into his path. He didn't recognize me at first. 6 years is a long time. But then he stopped. His face drained of color. "Evelina," he said. I didn't smile. "Going somewhere?" He looked past me like he was weighing his odds. But he knew. He didn't run. I pulled the cuffs from my belt. "You're under arrest for wire fraud and tax evasion." The staff watched in silence. No one said a word. He didn't ask how I found him. Because he knew. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. He had disappeared. But I had never stopped watching. I didn't move right away. That first night, after spotting his name buried in the restaurant filings, I sat alone in my apartment staring at the case notes I'd started assembling. I could have called it in then. I could have passed the file to someone else, let another agent handle the rest. But that would have meant letting go before the full picture was clear. Before I understood who he had become and what exactly he'd built out of the life he stole. So I waited. I watched. And I kept building. Over the next several months, I added new layers to the case file almost daily. Business registrations, fake employee rosters, personal transactions disguised as vendor payments. He was clever about it, just enough legitimate activity to keep the books clean enough for banks, just enough obfuscation to keep taxes low. But he was also arrogant. Sloppy. And that made him visible to anyone who knew how to read the shadows. He lived well. Not extravagantly, but comfortably. The restaurant turned enough profit to fund a high-rise condo overlooking the river, a late-model BMW, custom-tailored suits. I traced travel expenses to a resort in Vancouver, a private wine club in Napa, tickets to an out-of-state golf tournament. All charged to accounts hidden under shell names I matched to the fake LLCs I'd already flagged. He wasn't alone anymore, either. A woman showed up in the surveillance footage, brunette, early 30s, always dressed like she was on her way to a launch party. She showed up in reservation logs and credit card charges, always connected to the same transaction patterns. A dinner here. A boutique hotel stay there. I watched them walk through lobbies and parking garages together, arms brushing, her laughing at something he'd said. He held the door open. Tipped valets in cash. Walked like a man who thought the past had disappeared just because he had. There were days I felt something sharp rise in my chest. Not jealousy. Not even anger. Just disbelief. That someone could destroy everything you'd built, vanish without explanation, and then re-emerge like none of it had happened. But I didn't let it guide me. Instead, I focused on the work. We coordinated with the IRS Criminal Division. Shared data with regional banking investigators. There were offshore accounts we suspected he had access to, but we couldn't yet tie them to his name. We needed more. So I kept watching. One night, I reviewed a flagged transaction trail from a payment processing company tied to 2 of his delivery partners. A small charge, just under $500, stood out. It had been routed through an IP address in my home state. Not Oregon. Not Washington. But Texas. I ran it against an old record in my personal folder. The same IP had shown up on one of the devices we'd used together back when I was deployed. That night, he logged in to check a utility bill, probably forgot it was connected to anything else. It was a mistake only someone too confident would make. The next morning, I presented the updated report to my task force lead. He scanned it carefully, then looked up. "You've got him." We had what we needed for a federal warrant, bank fraud, tax evasion, identity theft, and enough supporting evidence to request a full asset freeze. That night, I went home and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the copy of the arrest plan on my desk. There was a line near the bottom where I'd written in my request, Agent Miller to assist in primary field contact. It wasn't about revenge. I wasn't planning some grand scene. I just needed to see it through. The Bureau moves precisely. Everything is coordinated. When the arrest was greenlit, we had every angle covered, exits, floor plans, vehicle tracking, staffing schedules. We knew what time he usually closed the restaurant, when he counted the drawer, when he turned the security system on. The night before, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous, but because my mind kept reviewing every page of the case file. I remembered the way his handwriting used to loop too high on the Y in his name. The way he used to twist his wedding ring when he was nervous, back when we were still engaged and trying to figure out where to live next. I remembered the sound of his voice when he promised to be there when I got back. And I remembered what it felt like to walk into an empty apartment and know you'd been erased. But this time, I wasn't the one being left behind. We moved in just after closing. He was in the back office alone. The other agents stood outside the door as I stepped in. He looked up from the register. For a second, he didn't react. Then recognition spread across his face like a shadow. He opened his mouth, probably to speak my name, but I shook my head once, just enough to stop him. "You're under arrest," I said quietly. "Bank fraud. Tax evasion. Identity theft." I moved toward him slowly. No aggression. No performance. He didn't resist. Just nodded. "You found me," he said under his breath. I never stopped looking. I cuffed him. "Read the rights." Stepped aside so the others could escort him out. The woman I'd seen in the videos stood near the bar, eyes wide. She didn't say anything. Just watched as he was led through the front doors and into the night. I stayed back to finish the paperwork. By the time I walked out, the street was quiet. No press. No crowd. Just the steady hum of streetlights and the occasional flicker of a passing car. No one congratulated me. There were no headlines. But I didn't need any of that. Because somewhere in the silence between that empty apartment all those years ago and the moment he sat handcuffed in the back of the transport van, I had already gotten what I came for. Not vengeance. Not closure. Clarity. He had lived like he was untouchable. But I'd spent years becoming someone who didn't miss. And now he was going to learn what it meant to leave loose ends. The charges were strictly financial. That was deliberate. When we brought him in and filed, we stuck to what we could prove beyond a shadow of doubt: wire fraud, tax evasion, misuse of federal lending programs. The emotional wreckage he left behind wasn't relevant on paper. And I didn't try to make it fit. I didn't need the Bureau to validate what he'd done to me. I needed to know that I could hold my ground and still walk away clean. He tried to speak when I cuffed him. I didn't let him. "Going somewhere" was all I said. Not because I wanted to sting him, but because that line was all I owed. The last time we'd spoken, really spoken, I was on a satellite call in a desert halfway around the world, trying to make small talk while ignoring the gut feeling that something had already shifted. He ended that call with, "I'll be here when you get back." And then he wasn't. I never asked him why. Not after the arrest. Not during processing. Not even when he was eventually indicted and brought before a judge. I watched the proceedings from the back of the courtroom, dressed in plain clothes, badge tucked out of sight. The prosecutor laid everything out with surgical precision: timeline, transactions, filings. The defense tried to soften it. Said he'd made mistakes under pressure. Said the debt had spiraled. That he hadn't meant to cause real harm. I didn't flinch. Because I knew better. He hadn't acted out of panic. He'd acted out of calculation. He could have left the money. Could have left a note. Could have admitted anything. Instead, he chose erasure. So no, I didn't need his apology. What I needed, what I spent the years rebuilding, was my own trust. Not in other people. That would come later, if at all. But in myself. In my judgment. In my ability to detect the difference between love and convenience. Between a partner and a liability. That didn't happen all at once. For a while after the case closed, I kept to myself more than usual. Not in a withdrawn way, just quietly protective. I kept my inner world small. Work, Ava, my own apartment again. I took time off when I could. Traveled solo. Picked up new habits that had nothing to do with vigilance. Rock climbing. Swimming. Anything that demanded focus, but didn't come with an endpoint to chase. I learned to enjoy boredom. For years, my life had been shaped by urgency, deployment, recovery, bureau deadlines. Even the pursuit of him had given me a kind of momentum. Now that it was over, I had to relearn stillness. It was harder than I expected. I kept waiting for the crash that never came. But something else did. I started trusting my instincts again. Not the ones that scan a room for exits or trace bank transfers in shell documents, but the quieter ones. I went on a few dates. Nothing serious. But each time I checked in with myself. Not for red flags, but for clarity. Am I choosing this because I want it or because it feels familiar? The difference mattered. And I stopped offering parts of myself that hadn't been earned. I didn't tell new people my whole backstory. Not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't define me anymore. I wasn't the woman who got robbed by her fiancé. I was a federal agent. A survivor. A builder. There were moments I'd forget about him for weeks. Then something small, a form, a restaurant receipt, the handwriting on a post-it, would bring it back. But even then, it didn't hurt the way it used to. It was just data. A record. Something filed away and indexed under closed. There was no redemption arc. Not for him. Maybe not even for us. The last update I got said he'd taken a plea deal. 5 years in federal prison with supervised release and financial restitution. It didn't undo anything. Didn't restore my credit overnight or refund the deployment savings he spent on a condo and Cabernet. But it was something. A line in the sand that said, you don't get to vanish and pretend it didn't happen. That was enough. Eventually, I stopped watching the calendar. The anniversary of the arrest came and went without fanfare. The next time I visited Ava, she noticed. You seem lighter, she said, handing me a coffee on her porch. I didn't have a poetic answer. Just shrugged. Got tired of carrying what wasn't mine. Because that's what it really came down to. The shame, the anger, the self-blame, it was all weight he left behind. I'd picked it up thinking it belonged to me. But it didn't. The only thing I needed to carry was the lesson. That I could survive betrayal. That I could rebuild from ashes without dragging the smoke into every room I entered. And that even when someone tries to erase you, you still get to write the ending. On your own terms. He took a plea. 5 years in federal custody with supervised release. No restitution. We froze what assets we could, but by the time it went through the courts, most of the money had already been moved, spent, or buried deep enough that it wasn't worth the cost of chasing. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't clean. But it was finished. I've been with the Bureau 6 years now. I've transferred twice, once to field operations in Denver and again to DC. Last year for a white-collar crime task force. The work is different here. Sharper. More political. But the principles are the same. Patterns, pressure, paperwork. And people who think they're above being seen. I don't talk about what happened unless it's necessary. If someone asks about my path to the Bureau, I keep it brief. Former military, deployed twice, financial crimes specialization. That's usually enough. But sometimes it comes up. A younger agent once pulled me aside after a debrief. She was dealing with a case involving a romance scam, an older woman conned out of her life savings by someone she thought she knew. She's humiliated, the agent said. Keeps blaming herself. I don't know how to get her to talk. I didn't lecture. I just nodded and told her what I'd learned the hard way. It's not about her judgment. It's about his choices. Keep the focus there. I still carry a photo from my deployment. Not of him, there aren't any left. I deleted everything years ago. The one I kept is of me. Standing on base, helmet off, sun in my eyes, dirt on my face. I'm grinning like I've just run a mile and somehow still want to keep going. It was taken 2 weeks before I got the first wire alert that my bank account had been drained. Sometimes I look at that version of myself and wonder if she had any idea what was coming. But mostly, I look at her because she reminds me of what survived. The clarity, the fire, the belief in something solid. She wasn't naive. She was generous. She trusted someone because he said he'd be there. That isn't weakness. That's hope. And hope doesn't deserve punishment. It deserves protection. So that's what I do now. I protect people who've been blindsided, who've had their names used, their money taken, their sense of safety turned against them. Because I've been there. And because I know what it feels like when justice doesn't arrive in a headline or a gavel. Sometimes it arrives quietly. No raised voices. No confrontation. Just a small room, a signed warrant, and a pair of steady hands closing cuffs around the wrists of someone who thought they'd never be found. The funny thing is, he never fought it. No appeals. No angry outbursts. Just silence. I don't know what story he tells himself about what happened. Maybe he still thinks he had his reasons. Maybe he tells people I was the bitter ex, out for payback. It doesn't matter. The truth is in the paperwork. And the legacy he left isn't a story worth preserving. But mine is. Because I didn't let it stop me. I didn't spend the rest of my life asking why, or wishing it had been different. I built something better in the space he cleared out. He made room. I filled it. There's something quiet about real closure. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, just a quiet acceptance that some chapters don't need to be rewritten. They just need to be finished. And mine is. I don't wonder where he is. I don't follow his case. He'll serve his time, then go wherever people like him go when they've burned too many bridges. But I stayed. I stayed and I thrived. I bought a place of my own last year. Small, efficient, no shared accounts. I still keep my passwords written down on paper, tucked into a locked drawer. Not because I'm scared. Just because I respect the lessons. There's power in knowing you survived something designed to dismantle you. There's peace in not needing revenge to feel like you won. And there's clarity in knowing the real justice wasn't just the cuffs or the conviction, it was becoming someone he'd never be able to touch again. That's the part one never say out loud. But I carry it with me every day. Quiet. Steady. Like a badge. Thanks for watching. Have you ever had someone steal from you, not just money but trust? Would you have made the arrest yourself if you had the chance? Or walked away and let someone else handle it? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear how you would have handled it. And if this story hit close to home, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's still waiting for their closure.